in our introductory video, we said that the goal of the firm is to maximize profit. So the goal of the firm is actually to maximize its profits. And how does the firm try to maximize its profits? Well, it first tries to choose a quantity, then set a price that is equal to the demand curve. So what happens here is actually the firm, graphically, the firm, and this is the demand curve here, this is Q and P. The firm chooses a quantity, and let's say that quantity is Q naught here, and so after choosing this quantity, it then chooses the price that is equal or where the demand curve is. So that would be P naught. And so how do we find the profit maximizing quantity that the firm should choose? How do we find Q in our case? So to find Q, we actually have to make certain mathematical equations here. So what we have to do, what we know is that the derivative of a function, in our case it's pi, the derivative of a function with respect to Q, or the derivative of pi with respect to Q, should be equal to 0. What this means is that pi here is either at a maximum, or a minimum, because the slope of pi over here at this maximum point is 0, and if we were to draw a minimum here, the slope of pi here is also 0. So the problem now is, how do we know if this Q here actually gives us the maximum or the minimum profit? So to find that, we have to take the second order derivative of pi with respect to Q. So if this is less than 0, then it means that the profit, the marginal profit, is actually decreasing. And so marginal profit would now be negative. And what this means is when the second order derivative of pi with respect to Q is less than 0, then profit is at a maximum. But when this is greater than 0, then profit is at a minimum. So now that we know that, we can actually set an example here. If the firm has this R is equal to 50Q, let's say 50Q minus 10, and we have this cost which is equal to Q squared minus Q, then we now have this information to find our pi. So pi, which is equal to R minus C, would now be equal to 50Q minus 10 minus Q squared plus Q. So when we simplify this, this becomes 51Q minus Q squared minus 10. And so now what the firm wants to do is to try to maximize its profits given his profit function. And to do this, we have to take the derivative of pi. We have to take the derivative of pi with respect to Q. And so what this gives us is 51 minus Q. And since we know that to find the maximum or the minimum, we have to equate this to 0. So this would now be equal to 0. And when we transpose Q here, what we find is Q would be equal to 51. And so the profit maximizing quantity or the profit minimizing quantity, we don't know yet, would be 51. So now to check if 51 actually gives us the maximum or the minimum, what we're going to do is actually take the second order derivative. So we're going to take d 2 pi dq2, and this would be equal to negative 1, which we know is less than 0, and therefore when q is equal to 51, pi is at max or at its maximum. Now this is how we solve for the profit maximizing quantity of a firm. We can actually play around with this equation here. If we were to actually look at d pi dq, let's go here. Okay, if we were to look at d pi dq, or the derivative of q with respect, the derivative of pi with respect to q, this is actually equal to the derivative of r minus c with respect to q. And this should be equal to 0. And so if we were to distribute or to use our rules of calculus or derivatives, we find that d pi dq is actually equal to dr dq minus dc dq. And this should be equal to 0. And so this dr dq here and our dc dq here is actually what we call our marginal revenue for dr dq and our marginal cost. And this should be equal to 0. And so the first order condition actually requires that mr minus mc is equal to 0. In other words, mr, or our marginal revenue, should be equal to our marginal cost when the firm is maximizing its profits. I forgot to mention, let's go back here in our example. So we found out here that when q is equal to 51, pi is actually at a maximum. But then what price does the monopolist set, or what price do the consumers get once this firm decides the quantity it wants to produce? Well, it depends on the demand curve. So let's say that we have a demand which is a function, or let's just make this p. So the firm is trying to decide price based on quantity. So p here is a function of q. So if pq is actually equal to, let's say, 100 minus q, just for an example, right? Okay, let's say that p of q, or the inverse demand, is equal to 100 minus q. So for the firm to decide on how much it would charge for one good, it would then plug in the q, or substitute the q that he acquired for profit maximization into the inverse demand curve. Oh, the inverse demand function. So what the firm will find is that p of q would now be equal to 100 minus 51, and so the firm would charge 49 units for a unit of good. And so its revenue is equal to PQ. Its revenue would be equal to 51 times 49, and its cost, which is equal to Q squared minus Q, would be equal to 51 squared minus 51. And so pi, the total profit of the firm, would now be equal to 51 times 49. 51 times 49 minus 51 squared plus 51. And so, again, the first step is to identify our revenue and cost functions and to find our profit function. So now that we have our profit function, we take the derivative of the profit function with respect to q and equate it to 0 to find the minimum or the maximum. And then we take the second order derivative of our profit, or pi, with respect to q to find if it's a maximum or a minimum. And so if it's a maximum, then we know that this would be our profit maximizing q, or quantity. And so the profit maximizing quantity we substitute into the inverse demand function, which is p of q. And when we substitute it into our inverse demand function, we find the optimal price that the monopolist has to charge. And so when we find that, we can now substitute q and p, or q star and p star. Let me write that down. This is equal to our q star, and this is equal to our P star, representing the optimal price and optimal quantity respectively. So we substitute them into our profit function here. We substitute them into our profit function here, and then we will find how much profit the firm actually gets